When you're just starting out with D&D, the number of available source books can definitely be a bit overwhelming. You've got core rules, add-on rules, adventures, campaigns, monster books, lore guides, and everything else in between. If you count all the official books right now, there's almost 60 to choose from. And that's not even getting into the countless lists of unofficial material that's out there too. So as someone who's new to D&D, figuring out where to start can be a bit of a daunting task. Which ones are the most important ones? Which ones should you really start out with? If you're just getting started, there's nothing wrong with looking at unofficial material. A lot of it has some really great stories and content. But to keep yourself from getting too overwhelmed with information that may or may not be used in your games, I'd recommend starting out with some of the official material first. The official books can be broken down into a few different categories. You've got rule books, which lay out how the mechanics of the game work. You've got adventure books, which are used to build anything from a single adventure to an entire multi year campaign. There's also what I like to call add on material that introduces things like new races, classes, magical items, weapons, spells, and new lore as well. For new players, there's three main books that I'd recommend picking up and reading over: the basic rules, the player's handbook, and the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, in that order. You can skip over the basic rules if you want, but that's also the only free one in the list, so your choice there. The player's handbook covers everything that the more starter basic rules does, but significantly expands on all of it. But if you want to get started with zero financial investment, go with those basic rules first. And then if you're a dungeon master or game master, or you're interested in DMing or running games, you'll want to take a look at the Dungeon Master's Guide also. Links to all of these books, including the free basic rules, are in the description down below. Starting with the basic rules, and again, these are free on Wizards website or D&D Beyond, and are technically all you really need to get started playing. These rules will introduce you to the character creation process, including information on 4 different races and 4 different classes. It covers dwarves, elves, halflings, and humans. And for the classes, you've got clerics, fighters, rogues, and wizards. There are many more races and classes than this in D&D, but don't forget, this is the free set of rules, just a sample. You'll also get some information on how to create your character's background and how to build out their personality too. And to round out the section on characters, you'll get some information on equipment and wealth, weapons, armor, shields, things like that. Also in the basic rules is some information on how the game is actually played. You'll get things like what ability scores and modifiers are and how they're used. You'll learn about the proficiency bonus, ability checks, saving throws. Plus, there's some information about how exploration may work in the game, some examples of things like NPC interaction and how you might want to handle that. And then the all-important combat section. You'll learn what actions you can take during combat, how long turns last in-game, how different levels of cover work when someone is trying to hide from an attack, and how damage and healing mechanics work also. The third part of these rules is all about magic. How magic works in the worlds of D&D, how spellcasting works, including different levels of spells and what spell slots are, and all about cantrips and rituals. To round out that section, you'll get some example spell lists for clerics and wizards. Rounding out the basic rules is a section for DMs. You'll see things like sample monster stats, some basics on how to run NPCs, and some tips on adventure creation and customizing encounter difficulty for different level and size parties. There's also some information on monster challenge rating and how that factors into constructing combat encounters. And then finally, there's a very brief section about giving your players magic items, including a few sample magic items you can use in the game. The basic rules, including the appendices, which cover conditions, things like being poisoned, restrained, paralyzed, and some of the gods of the multiverse, it comes in at about 180 pages. Now, compare that to the 300 something pages of the player's handbook. But for a free set of rules, it still has everything you need to get started playing D&D and won't cost you a thing. Moving on to the player's handbook now. This book significantly expands on everything that's written in the basic rules and introduces a lot more. It's got more detail on character creation, including more races and classes. You'll get the dwarves, elves, halflings, and humans that are all in the basic rules, but you'll also get dragonborn, gnomes, half elves, half orcs, and tieflings. For classes, you'll again have the ones in the basic rules: clerics, fighters, rogues, and wizards, with the addition of barbarians, bards, druids, monks, paladins, rangers, sorcerers, and warlocks. The player's handbook really expands on the character creation process by providing a lot more detail on later levels for each class, including all the abilities you'll gain at higher levels, how the leveling process works, and some recommendations on quick builds. There's also a full listing of all spells for each spellcasting class. But don't forget, additional source books will expand on these lists by introducing new spells. There isn't a single book in D&D that includes everything. There's an entire chapter in the player's handbook on character personality and background, including guidelines on how to choose your ideals, bonds, and flaws. There's several rollable tables for personality and background. Rollable tables are basically lists of options you can choose, and you can either roll whatever dies listed for the table and get a randomly selected option, or just choose whatever option looks enticing to you. Now, speaking of rollable tables, the player's handbook also includes tables so you can just choose a random height and weight for your character too. You get extensive information on equipment in the player's handbook also. Details about starting equipment and gold, more information on how armor and shields work when it comes to detailed game mechanics, and lists of various adventuring gear and tools. There's expanded sections on vehicles and mounts, how much various items may cost in the world while you're playing also. The player's handbook also goes into detail on multiclassing, which is essentially taking on a second class for your character and expanding their abilities instead of adding on additional levels for your first class. You can start to get really creative with your character and character builds when you add in multiclassing, but for just starting out, I'd stick with one class to begin with. With information on multiclassing is also more information on feats, including lists of available feats, which are talents or additional expertise that give your character some additional special abilities. Like in the basic rules, the player's handbook includes everything you need to know for gameplay mechanics, like what advantage and disadvantage mean, ability scores and modifiers, ability skill checks, saving throws, everything you need to know to play. And then we get into combat. The player's handbook expands out on combat mechanics significantly here. You'll get more detailed information on how initiative works and how it factors into the order of combat, how combat works step by step, and how turns work also. There's a section on all of the options for what you can do on your turn in combat: your action, your bonus action, your movement, your reactions, how you can order those and be strategic with them too. There's information on how movement works, especially for combat encounters, and expanded information on healing and damage. You'll also get a list of all the actions you can take in combat, things like attack, dash, disengage, which a lot of players forget even exists, and casting spells too. Now, speaking of spells, you'll get all of the information on how spells work, the mechanics behind casting spells, and how to know what your spell casting ability is and what your DC is. In addition, there's full spell list for all of the spell casting classes listed in the player's handbook: bards, clerics, druids, sorcerers, and wizards. But there's also spell lists for some classes that aren't full spellcasters, but still get access to some spells: rangers, paladins, and warlocks, and in some cases, fighters and rogues. Barbarians and monks, no spells for you. Rounding out the player's handbook, there's a section on conditions, just like the basic rules, and expanded information on the gods of the D&D multiverse and their pantheons, plus a section on the various planes of existence, like the material plane, the Feywild and Shadowfell, the astral plane and the ethereal plane, plus many, many more. The third book that I recommend to new players is the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. Now, where the basic rules and the player's handbook were more focused on game rules and how to do things, the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide is mostly about history and lore of the realms, specifically a region of the D&D multiverse known as the Sword Coast, hence the name of the book. The Sword Coast is located on the continent of Faerun on the planet Toril and has a pretty extensive history. This book is where you'll find a lot of that history and lore. It maps out the various races and alliances that can be found in the region, but not quite like the player's handbook does. This book is more centered around the stories and history of those races. You'll find information about the various locations in and around the Sword Coast and the history of those locations and their inhabitants. The Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide also lays out the various holidays in the realm and exposes you to the calendar of Harptos, used to track days and months in D&D. Out of our list of recommended starter books, this is the first one that really expands out on the races and classes from the player's handbook. It includes additional abilities, class options, and new spells for all of those races and classes. For example, barbarians gain new primal paths, clerics gain the arcana domain, and sorcerers get access to storm sorcery, among many other new features and abilities. In addition to those new abilities, this book lays out several new pre-built background options you can choose from when building out your character's backstory. And as a little bonus in the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, it lays out some options for using some of these class options in other D&D worlds. It provides some suggestions on transferring classes to settings such as Dragonlance, Eberron, Greyhawk, and homebrew worlds as well. The bulk of this book is history and lore, but as we've seen, there's sections that add a lot of playable options for whatever race or class you're playing from the player's handbook, plus new backgrounds and other options. Another good spot to learn more about D&D, especially if you're just getting started, is our Discord server. Link for that down below in the description. And if you're getting value out of this video so far, why not give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already? It really helps out the channel and you'll get more exposure to these videos, and it will satisfy the cravings of algorithm, the god of YouTube. Now, let's get into the Dungeon Master's Guide, also frequently abbreviated as the DMG. The Dungeon Master's Guide is designed to help dungeon masters, hence the name, build their own worlds, campaigns, and adventures. It contains guides that help DMs figure out what their world might look like, from the gods of the universe all the way down to individual shopkeepers and everything in between. Chapter 1 starts out with an overview of how to build a world and some of the considerations involved. Maps of the continents and regions, factions and organizations, and considerations for how magic might be handled. One thing to remember here, the amount of detail a DM wants to put in and the scope of what they design is entirely up to them. There's no requirements. There's no right or wrong here. These are just guidelines on how it could be done. The DMG helps walk through how to plan out a campaign, what types of events could be included for the players, what style of play the game might be, and how difficult the campaign could be too. It goes on to detail out the standard planes of existence that are in the standard D&D settings, and how to integrate them into a custom world and campaign too. It has guides for how to map out individual adventures and encounters, from how to structure an adventure to what sort of complications could be introduced, all the way down to how to introduce random encounters and what type of encounter may be best suited for different environments. And of course, no world is complete without NPCs. Dungeon Master's Guide has tips for creating NPCs from scratch, whether those NPCs are shopkeepers, contacts for the party throughout the world, or the enemies and villains the party will be facing throughout the adventure campaign. It talks about motivations and personality traits for those NPCs. Writing NPCs can definitely be complicated, and giving them a good backstory can help make them much more engaging for players. Encounters need to take place in some sort of setting, and the Dungeon Master's Guide helps with that as well. It lays out multiple different types of adventure environments, from the standard dungeon to wilderness settings and settlements of any size. And just like no world is complete without NPCs, no campaign is complete without some sort of treasure for the party. The DMG suggests all different types of treasures, how and when they can be awarded or discovered, including some rollable tables to generate random treasure on the fly if that's your thing. And we're not just talking about some, +1 golden hilted swords or anything here. It's got sentient magic items and artifacts as suggestions too. The Dungeon Master's Guide wraps up by discussing the game rules from the DM's perspective instead of the player's perspective, including how to introduce and discuss table or homebrew rules that might deviate from any of the official materials. It helps DMs design combat encounters, social interactions with NPCs or between player characters, and even how to handle things like chase scenes. At the end of this guide, we have what's known as the Dungeon Master's Workshop. It includes all sorts of options for various abilities and skills, adventures, and variations on all of them. It steps through the process of creating homebrew items such as new monsters, new spells, magic items, or even character options. Creating new designs for a game can be a bit intimidating at times, but the Dungeon Master's Guide can help with that, especially with the included random dungeon generator in the form of a rollable table, lists of monsters, and a few sample encounter maps that can be used in-game. So you've got a couple different options of where you can find these books. If you like digital versions, one of the best spots to get them is D&D Beyond. They have interactive copies with an excellent table of contents sections. Plus, any of the source books that have maps in them will usually include two different copies of the map, one for the DM and one for the players. This really comes in handy, especially when you're running games on virtual tabletops. If you're looking for physical copies, you've always got the official Wizards of the Coast shop, and Amazon is always an option you can take too. But I encourage you to try and find your local game store, check them out, and if you like them, support a local business by getting your D&D materials from them. Yes, Amazon will probably be cheaper and easier, and there's nothing wrong with taking that option if you want. Wizards is also starting to work on physical and digital bundles, where you can buy both the digital version on D&D Beyond and get a physical copy of the book as well. Now, one thing I want to add, regardless of which books you might be using, keep in mind, all these rules are really just guidelines. Your DM will ultimately decide which rules are used at the table, hopefully with some input from the players. The text written in the source book may be the official rules, but they're not written in stone. They're not divine commands from the heavens. They can be tweaked. They can be adjusted. They can be ignored. That's one of the things I love about D&D so much, how flexible the game is and how any group can play however they like. So just keep that in mind when you're playing, and don't be surprised if your DM tweaks a couple of things at the table. So I really hope this video has been helpful for you. If it has, give it a like and comment down below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.